I almost feel like I should stand, but I'm not going to. But I'll try to be like high a little bit. It's great to be here. It's great to be with Rita Dove. This is the second year in a row in May in which I've had the incredible honor and the incredible foolishness to try to speak kind of at the same time as Rita Dove. At our graduation ceremonies this past year, Rita had written an amazing poem that she shared with our graduating class, and that poem was shared with the graduates right as commencement final exercises began, and then I had to speak right afterwards. Dear God, that was a terrible mistake. So I'm going to try to speak incredibly little today, and for us all to have as much time as we can. Rita, it's just a delight and an honor to be with you. Rita, one of the things that your poetry frequently attends to is the importance of slowing down and listening. And you make that word reverberate, you kind of rescue it from our ordinary practice of, no, listen to me. And there's just a sense, as we read you, listen. So what I'd like to do is to begin by inviting you to read a poem so that we can listen to it, which Rita Dove.
Thank you, Ian, thank you, Jim. It's great to see all of you there, and maybe we can mingle a little bit afterwards. It's wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to be here on such a beautiful day, and to, I guess, close out this season of Arts on the Hill. It has such a great ring to it, and with that in mind, I thought I'd read this poem because it is something that pertains to Charlottesville, pertains to the university. It was a poem that was a long time in coming. I've been here from, I'm not going to say how long, and I knew of and became more and more aware of Henry Martin, who had been the ringer of the bell here during the time when he in fact was a mixed race, I guess you could say, a mixed race man who was born on the day that Jefferson died and rang that bell here, summoned all the students to their classes. And so this poem, I read it at the bicentennial celebration, and it seems right to do it here. So, bell ringer. This is told in the voice of Henry Martin, who said at one point, "I am as true to that bell as to my God." I was given a name. It came out of a book. I don't know which. I've been told the great man could recite every title in order on its shelf. Well, I was born, and that's a good thing. Although I arrived on the day of his passing, a day on which our country fell into mourning. This I heard over and over from professors to farmers, even dual-scarred students, sometimes in grand company, remarked upon in third person. A pretty way of saying more than two men in a room means the third can be ignored, as I was when they spoke of my birth and Mr. Jefferson's death in one breath. Voices dusted with wonderment, faint sunlight quivering on a hidden breeze. I listen in on the lectures whenever I can, holding still until I disappear beyond third person. And what I hear sounds bright enough. It eases my mind. I know my appearance frightens some of the boys, the high cheeks and freckles, and not quite Negro eyes, flaring gray as storm-washed skies back home. It shames them to be reminded. So much for book learning. I nod as if to say, "Uncle Henry, at your service," then continue on my way through darkness to start the day. This is my place. Stone rookery perched above the citadels of knowledge, alone with the bats and my bell, keeping time. Up here, molten glory brims until my head's rinsed clear. I am no longer a dreadful coincidence, nor a debt crossed off in a dead man's ledger. I am not summoned, dismissed. I am the clock's keeper. I ring in their ears. And every hour, down in that shining, blistered republic, someone will pause to whisper, Henry. And for a moment, my name flies free.
So, Rita, you began with listening, and you began with the sound. You began with a ringing of a bell, and there's a bell that still sounds on these grounds, and it continues to chime the hours. When we're here at a moment like this, we can hear that bell and its resonance, and we can be reminded of the agony that went into the ring of the bell and the pride that went into the ring of that bell. How do we hear that bell when we're not listening to you? How do we hear that bell on grounds and that man?
Well, first of all, I think that one of the things that poetry does that is so special is that it connects to something that is inarticulate in us. And when you read it, you think, oh, I'm not crazy. I felt that way before. I just didn't have words for it. And we value words for giving a kind of a imprimatur, giving a kind of seal of approval on our emotions, which are often squirrely and strange. So when we hear that bell, I think that a bell will always bring up all sorts of emotions. It physically stirs you because it hits you. At times we might think about, gosh, that bell's been ringing for all these years, and we might just think it's a beautiful sound. But in reading a poem like this, I would hope that from now on you would also remember what bells meant, and as you say, the great sacrifice that people had when they had to ring them, because that was quite a labor, and you often went deaf, from it. But to realize that these are the ways in which we marked off our life. So.
Again, part of what I find striking about that is that bells ring every hour, on every hour, on every hour, and there has not been a broken hour between that moment and this.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And we're still in that bell ringing time.
Yeah.
When our students come to grounds for the first time, do you think they hear that bell? And if they don't, how can we help them hear it?
I do know one thing, that if that bell did not ring, they would hear it. Not ring. And that's the kind of wonder I think that none of us should lose. That wonder, there are things that you walk by every day and don't think about. And yet they are so important for how you situate yourself in the world. And if we can listen, if we can look, if we can breathe and smell what's around us, then we feel more alive. And so often we're just going to rush. I think what happens in the university, and I see it in students, undergraduate students, graduate students, as their eyes begin to open, then the soul begins to blossom. It's sort of like, wow, I never thought of that quite that way before, or I haven't used that part of my brain yet to figure out something before. And once that starts happening, there's no stopping it, I think.
Yeah. With kind of lyrics like, but also violent intensity, because the echo that we're hearing is the echo of bondage.
Yes.
The echo of a rememory that continues to sound. There's on 2 or 3 occasions in the poem you talk about being in the third person and being beyond the third person. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean, about what it means to be named and spoken of in the third person and to move beyond the third person?
Well, the thing that happens in that poem is that Henry Martin is, treated as a non-entity by the professors, by everyone at the university. He's there, he's indispensable, but he's not there either. He's in the third person. They can talk about him as a he or this and as if he's not there. One of the things that I've been absolutely, I guess, obsessed by in terms of writing is to insist upon the identity of forgotten characters, that each one of us bears in us a multitude of emotions and dreams and wishes, and none of that should ever be erased. And what bondage does, of course, and what slavery does, what class differences do too, to a lesser extent, but still, it's to erase that identity. And I think there could be nothing more tragic to a living human being than the erasure of identity.
There's another incredibly resonant phrase. It's an interview, but Rita is a poet. And I'm going to ask you some questions about your life, but you have to spend time with the poetry. Dreadful coincidence is just another such striking line, and I take it that dreadful coincidence is the coincidence of a passing that the nation publicly remembered and a coming into life of a life that the nation publicly chose to not pay attention to, this dreadful coincidence. Can you just talk about the idea of dreadful coincidence a little bit, that time coincides with this, and how poetry does the work of calling to our attention dreadful coincidence?
Well, I think that we would like to have our history cleansed and orderly, so that we could say, okay, this happened, that happened, oh, this is a reason why that happened. And yet we all know that life is messy, coincidental, and full of dreadful ironies as well. And so, one of the reasons why I came to the University of Virginia was because I felt, not only because there were some great minds here and it was just sparked, and I could feel that, but I also felt that this is the kind of the crux of the American dreadful coincidence, you could say. And that if you don't figure this out as a country, as a nation, then we're doomed. This is the place to be, to study that. The idea that this man who was ignored in a shadow and everything, was born on the same day as Jefferson. It's a dreadful coincidence to those class societies, because they'd rather not think about it, because that's a connection, right? You'd rather be able to keep these things separate. Henry Martin's over there, Jefferson's over there, and they never the twins will meet. But that slight coincidence, plus the fact that he had these gray eyes, and and he was he couldn't, the whole thing could not be ignored. That there was all sorts of things happening in terms of slave trade, in terms of racial identity, in terms of all of the horrors of slavery were right there present. He was the walking contradiction in a way to the ideal of this university. Or the ideal of this nation, which is why near the end of the poem, Henry says, this shining, blistered republic, because that's also a contradiction and a coincidence, that it's shining because it's trying to do something new, it's, all that, but it's already blistered because it's being built upon this horrendous trade. And so, but to give him, for Henry, I think what he what he finds solace in, what he finds, what do you want, pride is too easy a word, but let's just say he finds his heartfelt, he finds his fulfillment in the fact that they know his name. Someone down there knows his name. It might be a student who's running late to class, who knows about old Henry, but they say his name when he rings the bell. And that's for him is saying, you know, I am here. I am here, and without you, you cannot conduct your life in orderly fashion. So the dreadful coincidence is part of the legacy of the slave trade. The shining and the boosted republic is what we're working with, and we hope that someday the bell can ring clear.
Thank you. And thank you for any of us who have read or heard that poem. We cannot hear that bell now without hearing Henry's name. Thank you. One last question just about this. This comes from a new and astonishing collection of poetry with an amazing title, Playlist for the Apocalypse. And so we began with music. You think of the playlist. We make playlists, we listen to playlists. You have given us a new playlist. Can you just tell us a little bit about Playlist for the Apocalypse? The title is a one-line poem. Can you just talk a little bit about Playlist for the Apocalypse?
Well, it's not exactly a cheery title, is it? I think, well, you know, I was working on this book for a long time. Many of the poems had not found their home. Some of them are, I don't know, 10, 11, 12 years old or older. And then there were newer poems. The pandemic hit, the lockdown hit, the university closed. I mean, we closed our classrooms and went to virtual. And I had suddenly a little bit of time, because I wasn't traveling quite as much, to listen, as I counsel everyone else to do, and I was, you know, running around. And I thought, what gets us through a day? What gets us through, you know, a semester? What gets us through a year? What kind of metaphor could I think of, or kind of, you know, symbol could I think of to get us through? And then I thought about playlists, because we make them for friends, we make, you know, and they are eclectic, they're very different. You know, one song is supposed to cheer you up, and another one's supposed to, you know, for sleep and all that. And I thought, that's what these poems want to be. They want to be companions during this time. So that's how it came about. My editor kind of said, Rita, really? You know, you really want to put out a book in the middle of the pandemic? I said, yes. Playlist for the Apocalypse. So that's how it came about.
Thanks. So it strikes me, it's another dreadful coincidence, though, because how we spend our time and how we get through the day, and the kind of the joy and the delight of music, we need to escape into it. We need to dance to it. We need to kind of pause inside of it. And there is this kind of rhythmic joy of the notion of the playlist. That's my playlist. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, time can be apocalyptic around us. So, okay, I'm going to go to you from your poetry for a little bit. Do you remember the very first poem that you wrote? And can you tell us about the very first poem that you wrote, or the first poem that you remember writing?
Yes, I can actually, because it was 4th grade. There had been some little scraggly things that, you know, that were pretending to be haiku before that, but I don't remember them. What happened in this case was Easter, and the teacher had asked everyone to do something different. You could do a project, you could paint, you could write and all that. So I thought, oh, I'd write a poem. And I wrote this poem. I started it off, it's called The Rabbit with a Droopy Ear. And count on me to have to give my rabbit a defect. I didn't know, and I started writing it. It rhymed, you know. Mr. Mr. Rabbit was big and brown, but he always wore a frown. He was sad because the spring was near because he had winter beer. And so I had the rhyme to get me through it. I did not know how I was going to solve this thing, because this was a grumpy rabbit. But the rhyme helped me. And so I kept going and going and going until I finally, I was so happy. The surge of joy when I discovered how to solve this problem, which was he hung from a tree and then his ears were hanging. Well, not both ears were hanging up. I think that was his last line. Hip hip hooray, let's toast him a cup for now, both ears were hanging up. Anyway, so, but this was it was a joy of finding words that kind of sang and they helped me write the ending. So it was that was it. Yeah. I was hooked.
Okay, so that's great. Like, we should spend a whole night on that poem. A rabbit and the importance of rabbits in African American history, African American literary tradition, right? Tricksters, right?
Yeah.
Brer, the rabbit is not an accident. The rabbit is a guiding figure in the history of African American literature and writing. So I think that rabbit is part of that tradition. I mean, do you think trickster rabbit, but also the hung rabbit? I mean, the hung rabbit is resonant of the worst of who we've been and the most violent of who we've been. So, how do you think about your progression from that poem? Did you know that's it? I'm gonna be a poet. Did you anything that as you look back, right? It's still in your mind, right? That little rabbit in that moment, 4th grade. So you're 9 or 10, writing. Did you feel? Looking back, do you feel like you found yourself then, or no, that was just a really cool thing, and it was 10 years later, 20 years later, 5 years later, that I knew that there was something that was calling to me from the voice of that rabbit?
I always felt I was that rabbit, and I did not know that I was going to be a poet then. I knew that this I loved to do, it gave me more joy than almost anything else. But the world said, the community said, you must be a credit to your race and become a doctor, lawyer, and teacher. And so somewhere, though my parents never said that, I knew that that's what I was supposed to do. So I think it wasn't until I was in college, actually, undergraduate school, that I stumbled into a creative writing class. Now this, I was supposed to be taking a composition class, and the professor got ill, and they asked the short story, creative writing, short fiction professor to take over. So he just came strolling in, I still remember, in an electric blue suit, and he said, we're just going to write stories and you will learn composition. And I said, there's a class for this? I mean, really, I did not know that there were creative writing classes. I said, this is a place where I could be legitimate, tell my parents I was getting an English degree, because I was going to be a lawyer or something, pre-law, and then I could go on from there. And so it wasn't until then that I really realized that that's what I wanted to do more than anything else. I also wanted to be a musician, and I had been training as a cellist since I was 10, too. And so that, I think if I hadn't been a poet, I would have been a musician.
You are.
But then I just after I was at undergraduate school, I kind of thought, well, if I can get someone to pay for my graduate education as a poet, I'll go until I starve. And that was the decision, right, as a junior. I thought, I will go until I have to, I can't eat anymore, and then I will see what else I can do to earn money. But I wanted to be a poet, so that's what happened.
The poem that you read for Final Exercises last year is a homecoming poem. It's a poem about returning and about planting. and about seeing your father, I believe,
Yes.
planting, and your being in that soil, grounded with him while he's planting and watching him. Do you remember the homecoming when you came home and you told your parents that you were going to be a poet?
Oh, yes, I do. It was Thanksgiving. And I came home, I was a junior, I came home and I told my mother that I was going to be a poet. And I remember we were in the kitchen and she said, "You tell your father." And so I went into the other room where my father was reading the paper and said I was going to be a poet. And he just kind of put his paper down for a minute and thought, and then he said, "Well, my father was a chemist. And so he said, I don't know much about poetry, I don't understand it, so don't be upset if I don't read it." Which to me was like giving me, I mean, that was a ticket to ride. Fine.
Good for all of you. So I think that you are a musician, and I think you're a chemist as well, because you do alchemy. Rita, you're a poet. Can you read us another poem?
Okay. Let's see. You know, I asked my graduate students to suggest poems because I really wanted to know what they thought. And I must admit I was surprised by this one, but I thought this was actually kind of perfect. This poem is called "Describe Yourself in 3 words or less." I'm not the kind of person who praises openly or for profit. I'm not the kind who will steal a scene unless I've designed it. I'm not a kind at all, in fact. I'm itchy and pug-willed, gnarled and wrong-headed, never amorous but possessing a wild, thatched soul. Each night I set my boats to sea and leave them to their bawdy business. Whether they drift off maddened, moon-rinsed, or dock in the morning scuffed and chastened is simply how it is, and I gather them in. You are mine, I say to the twice-dunked cruller before I eat it. Then I sing to the bright-beaked bird outside, then to the manicured spider between window and screen. Then I will stop and forget the singing. See, I have already forgotten you. And that poem was in response to, I think it was really in response to a resistance to being categorized. At that point, I think I was poet laureate, and everyone was trying to say, Rita Dove is this kind of poet, or that kind of poet, or she writes for the people, and I'm like, well, who else are you writing for? I mean, but the urge to put me in a box and say this is exactly the kind of poetry that I write, or exactly the kind of person I am. And I think that all of us have our wild, thatched souls that go off in all different directions, and that though we do have to choose a major, that kind of stuff, there are so many points at which other things intersect, and that was that resistance. Yeah.
Okay. So there's a line in there, "I'm not a kind at all,"
Yeah.
Which is just so striking. It sounds like that's part of what that poem is about, right? That I refuse to be a kind.
I refuse to be a kind. I also refuse to define myself in 3 words. So that's how
Wild Thatchery. Can you talk about Thatchery? So Thatchery is one of those, ancient art. It's a very precise, art. It's the hand, is involved in it, and the cutting and the laying. And you think of thatch as very orderly, and then there's something about, so thatched still, right? There's order, right? There are metrics, right? Mm-hmm. There's poetic form, but there's the bringing the wild into the thatch. Can you just talk about being wild and thatched?
it's what I think energizes any kind of art. The sense that there's a form, whether it's, you know, you're working in watercolors and you know what watercolors can do, or you know what the human body can do, and so you can only dance a certain way, you know, because the body doesn't bend the other way. But at the same time, it's a stretch and to push against your form, and therefore show its counters. So that's, in a certain way, if I'm going to talk about poetry in its form, is what's so wonderful about form in poetry is that it's not that, oh, look, she rhymes, isn't that great? I mean, that's, you know, but it's that the rhyme means something. It means something for the way in which it massages your soul or whatever. Or if I'm writing a poem that is a villanelle, which is a form that keeps repeating lines, there's a reason why those lines keep coming back. And that kind of Thatchery, I guess you could call it, pushes up against the wildness of what you want to say, the howl that you want to make to the universe. I mean, a howl is good and effective, and it helps clear the thing, but, you know, doesn't get a lot of work done. Keep filming it. But there's also this, the Thatchery it is that ancient art, but it involves the hands, and the hands get wounded in them. You know, it is not an easy art. There is pain involved.
Yeah. Is there pain involved in writing poetry?
Of course.
Can you talk about that?
It's great pain. No. Well, there's pain because language does not, well, first of all, there's pain because I think poetry is about all aspects of life. So, if we're talking about everything that happens to us, obviously there's the good and there's also the bad. I think it's really hard to write a happy poem. And Tolstoy also famously said, all happy families are alike. Because when we're happy, we do not care. We do not need anything else to connect us necessarily. But, so dealing with the darker sides, dealing with the apocalypse, dealing with the moments of sadness, of being erased, whatever, is one of the things that the arts can help us with. Yes, that means that there's pain involved, because you're dealing with these dark things. I'm trying to wrestle to get it articulated in a way that can help us grasp it and deal with it. There's also the pain of just not finding the right word, because we use language every day, but there's also, sometimes it takes years to find the right word. I keep telling my students that.
So I'm going to turn to the students. You are a poet, you're a poet laureate, and you're a teacher, and you've dedicated yourself to the work of writing and to teaching, and I'm guessing there are some students here today. And we are going to open up some time at the end for questions from you, so please be ready whenever you want. Why is teaching important to you? And sort of within that, what are some of the things that you want to convey to your students? And maybe most particularly to the students who don't yet know if anyone will listen. We know you have caused us to know that we need to listen when you write. And you know that people will listen when you write. But early in their careers, your students don't know if anyone will listen when they write, but yet they write. What do you want to convey to them, and how do you help them think through that moment when they're waiting for the others to listen to them?
Well, I began teaching because that spark was opened in me, and it was so phenomenal to realize that there was a story or an emotion in me that was worth someone else listening to and responding to. It's not only listening, it's also having someone say, I understand how you feel, I felt that too. That connection, which goes beyond or deeper than language or anything. That connection is gold. It's the thing which will keep this humanity, running. That is one of the driving forces, the reason why I became a teacher. What I tried to teach the students right away is that two things. Nothing you are feeling inside or thinking or wanting to write about is crazy. None of that. You are a human being. It's what you have to do is write it so that someone else can connect to it. So the second part is that language is your medium. Do not think of language, don't think of, okay, let me put it this way. See, and I'm gonna teach a whole class. That just as, when you see a basketball player and they're gonna be training and they're training to, they know that their body is their instrument, right? I think very often writers will feel like that the emotions that they have are the instrument only. And so when you try to articulate something, get it out, and it doesn't work, the feelings of, oh, I failed, I'm it's crazy, it's stupid. No, it's that the language wasn't right. Your medium, you haven't figured out how to do that. Separate the medium from the emotion, and then you can actually revise and get better. So that the idea, and I'm going to use a musical term again, I guess, the idea is to have the poem be scored in such a way that when a reader reads it without your voice or anything, they breathe in the same rhythm that you want them to, which means periods and commas. When I start talking about dashes versus semicolons, students are like, what, grammar? I said, yes, grammar. Because they give you pauses, they give you gasps, they give you all this stuff. And I said, this is part of it too. You want someone else to be able to physically be with you. And so those are the two things I try to impart. It takes a time.
It takes time, and it takes courage.
Yeah, it takes courage.
Yeah.
It does take courage.
So, because I do want to save as much time as possible, I have lots of questions, but I'm not going to ask them all because we're going to have two more poems, Rita, with your permission, and then we'll open things up. So, could we ask you to read one more, and then a couple questions, one more after that, then we're going to open things up. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Well, this is okay. I wasn't sure, but I'm so glad.
Yes.
Okay. This is a poem that is, again, it's a poem that what we call a persona poem because the person who is saying it is not me. This musician, and he's a mixed race violinist. I'm not going to tell you the whole story. This book, which is called Sonata Melodica, is a kind of a biopic in verse. Tells the story of this musician who was a violinist who was so good that he became, that Beethoven had in fact composed a sonata for him. And then they got in an argument and Beethoven withdrew his dedication. The book is really about the rise and the fall of fame. And in this particular poem, the musician he's playing. It's a kind of a Bridgerton moment. This is the 19th century. He's playing for a bunch of people who are obviously not listening. And here goes. It's called Tafelmusik, which is German for table music or just, casual music, occasional music. Tafelmusik. Style and flattery will get you the life you deserve. One table setting after another, beer and cards in the park at Ranelagh, some lame poet enthusing over the pale moon under the pricking stars, while Lord Petersham glimpses himself in the sheen of his boots and smiles as he pulls out the snuff box for this very day. At least the unnamed gentleman who each evening squires a different dog from his own bisque collection knows that's all he wants. Does all that powder make them happier? There's the Duchess of Devonshire snooting past with her lapdog, as big a yawn as ever. Look at sly little Miss Lady Wilson prattling on. She's absolutely smitten with the divertimento. Smitten, as if this were a love affair and she needs to be hit between the eyes to actually feel something. Divertimente do not smite, only God does. Here's a modest proposal. Shut your eyes for 5 minutes and listen. Easy music, yet it demonstrates respectable employment of choral modulation and is utterly capable of transporting a weary soul out of this frenzy and onto the plane of perfect comprehension. And there is your bliss, flowing beneath all the fretting. There is your ecstasy and ruin and entitlement, all the religion you'll ever need. So, yeah, that I had to get back
So you have to. All right, so I have smite and smitten.
yeah.
You start with how smitten can be a word that we use and we don't understand what it means. I'm smitten. And then this beautiful line, divertimenti do not smite, only God does. And so my question to you, Professor Dove, does poetry smite? And when it does, how does it leave us smitten?
So good, I like that. Well, I don't have to say anything, do I? Of course, yes, poetry smites. And then, Emily Dickinson, of course, said, if it doesn't take the top of your head off, it's poetry. It smites, and sometimes that's a good one, a good smite, and sometimes it pierces your soul, but hopefully if it's great poetry, then you're absolutely smitten. I've always loved that word, smitten, because we have made it into something so gorgeous and something desirable, and yet smite is never used in that fashion.
So I'm going to, I believe you, but I'm going to push you. Okay, so W.H. Auden, as you know, once said, writing about another poet, poetry makes nothing happen. Poetry makes nothing happen. It survives in the valley of its making, where executives would never want to tamper. It flows on south from ranches of isolation and the busy griefs, raw towns that we believe and die in. It survives, a way of happening, a mouth. Can you talk about that conception of poetry which belies itself, it's lying about itself, but which I understand to be in some ways both a claim for the fact that poetry makes something happen and its freedom not to have to make something happen. Can you just talk a little, because I was struck when I was reading Kaufmannsmusik and thinking about smiting this line. How do you think about yourself in relation to that long poetic conversation about poetry's obligation to accomplish something and poetry's freedom to be, to happen?
It has a lot to do with our definition of what it means to make something happen. What is worth being written down in the history books is one way to think of things that happen. To chronicle one's own love story, that's another way of, when did this happen between us? So when he says poetry, when Auden says poetry makes nothing happen, then he immediately says, he gives you all sorts of reasons for why it actually is making something happen. He's asking you actually to think about how you define importance and happenings. And then he says it survives. It survives, and the best kind of happening that you can have.
Yeah.
What I think he's saying, to take it or to assume that poetry is going to be directed at something and will, move a government that is to, in a certain way, to put it in a box, or to make it into a club, as opposed to having it smite you unawares.
Yes. Okay, so I'm going to ask you one last poem, and then we'll open things up. So anything you wish. Someone, by the way, told me what you might read, but you should read whatever you wish. So could you read us one last poem, and then we'll open things up.
Okay, I will read it's a short poem, mainly because it comes from this book, A Playlist for the Apocalypse. Also because it's a poem that came out of, I said that, poetry happens everywhere. When our daughter was very young, she was 4 or 5. She's now a professor. Oh my God. But when she was that age, she used to go around, and children finding ways of making you feel guilty. She would sing this little song, Nobody Loves Me But the Spring Cricket. And we would try to find out about the spring cricket. So I began to write these poems told from the point of view of the spring cricket. I have no idea who the spring cricket is. But it became a thing. And this one is one of the last one in this group for the spring cricket. So the cricket is speaking. Postlude, let's go. You prefer me invisible, no more than a crisp salute, far away from your silks and firewood and woolens. Out of sight, I'm merely an annoyance, one slim, obstinate wrinkle in night's deepening trance. When sleep fails, you wish me shushed and back in my hole. As usual, you're not listening. Time stops only if you stop long enough to hear it passing. This is my business. I've got 10 weeks left to croon through. What you hear is a lifetime of song.
So I think that rabbit and that cricket share a kinship. So there's a line, I'm so glad to hear that, it's a remarkable poem, it's part of a remarkable sequence, and the idea of this slim, obstinate wrinkle is really compelling. And to think that part of what you have done for all of us is to open up a slim, obstinate wrinkle of language and of what needs to throw us back into ourselves and what needs to throw us into the possibility of language is remarkable. So I am going to stop talking and I'm going to stand up now so I can see people who might want to ask a question. I'm not quite sure how it all works. Am I passing the mic or there's a mic?
Just have them stand up.
And if you would just kind of say your name, who you are, and then ask Professor Duff a question.
I'll stand up just so I can see you.
Hello, I'm Quinn. Thank you for reading us poems from different people's perspectives. I think it's a beautiful thing to develop empathy for someone who's not you. But do you ever worry that you didn't get it right, and have you ever gotten it wrong?
Ooh. The question, I'll kind of repeat it in case you didn't hear it in the back, was about writing poems from other people's perspectives, and did I worry about getting it, if I got it right, did I ever get it wrong? I always worry about getting it wrong. I write those poems out of great respect for that person, no matter who they are, but you can get it wrong. All you can do is just try, and I have done some personas, as you can tell, which are very far from me, male personas. I've done, voices of people I really didn't particularly like. But I think all you can do, I don't know if I've ever gotten it wrong. I mean, someone will tell me, I'm sure. And I'm sure there are times where people would think that I got it wrong and I shouldn't have presumed to take on that voice. My only reason for taking on those voices is because they are hurt. And I felt that they were talking to me and saying, you know, tell my story, tell my story. So then I try to honor. What I do try to do, and what I do counsel like all of my students if they're doing persona poems, is that you have to know as much about that person as you can. You have to really just bury yourself, not just the facts of their life, but you know, if it's a different century, you have to look at the census records so that you know how many black people, white people, you know, young people, who would they see as they walk down the street. You really must commit to honoring that life, and then you try your best.
Another question?
Hello.
Hello.
I have a question about one of the sections in Playlist for the Apocalypse. I love the 8 Angry Odes section. That was one of my favorites. And I was wondering if you could talk about how did you find anger in that ode form, I guess, and how, I guess that's another juxtaposition that you sort of have, and if you could talk about that a little bit.
Okay, thank you. That's one of my students. Used to ask me this question. The question was about one of the sections in Playlist for the Apocalypse is called 8 Angry Odes. And the question was, how did I arrive at that kind of juxtaposition, you know, and to do that? Well, one of the labels that I had been fighting against in my life had been the idea that I was such a nice person. Or a nice poet, you know, it's all, you know, and I thought, but, you know, actually, I'm angry a lot of the time. And I thought that the poems reflected that, you know, but, so, part of the thing about the 8 Angry Odes was that the idea that you can praise something but be really angry at the fact that it's not the way it should be. And in a way, it gave me permission to be really mean-spirited in some of those poems, which was kind of fun. In fact, I even took on Shakespeare, who I love and adore, and Shakespeare was one of my earliest influences, but, you know, I had to take him down. Come on. This is like being in my class the first day when no one says anything.
Rita, thank you for reading your poetry.
Sure.
I'm curious, what would you tell that 4th grade girl today?
Wow. What would I tell that 4th grade girl today? First of all, I'd tell her to get out of that tree. No, really, seriously, I would say, you know, this is worth something. I don't think I believed it was worth something. And I think that I was also very lucky in the sense that because now this is going to sound weird, but because I was a girl, I was the second oldest, I had an older brother, I think my parents figured I was just going to get married someday. So they didn't pay that much attention to what I was doing, though I was doing very well in school. That gave me a little room, a little private virtual room to write in. But I didn't believe that I was going to really become something. And that's what I tell her. You know, don't just fudge around. You have a voice.
We have time for one more question.
Okay, along a similar vein, along a similar vein of that question, what advice would you give to young poets, like that 20-year-old you that told your parents about wanting to be a poet?
Okay, so now we go from 4 years old to 20, from 10 to 21, advice when I give poets. You know, it's always difficult to give that advice because each person is different. But, you know, I can say, you know, you should believe in yourself. I can say you have a story to tell. I can say, you know, but whether that's going to ping or not depends on what they do. What I like to try to do if I'm talking to a young poet is to ask, engage them in conversation to find out what they're passionate about besides poetry. Just what you're passionate about. Say, well, describe it to me. You know, and then you say, oh, it's a poem. You know, you need to write about that. You've got a unique angle. You need to tell someone else how to do that. That really helps. But I also would tell a poet, someone who is really already starting to write, is to read as much as you can, but to read as widely as you can. To do not just sit there and say, oh, I'm going to read only what one professor told me to read. I used to go to the library and just kind of go to the poetry section and just pick a book out at random and read. And not just poetry. Not just poetry. Read other books as well. The world is not made of books, though I wish it were. No. But it's made of human beings moving through and doing all sorts of things. And there's poetry in you know, genetics. There's great poetry in genetics. There's poetry in everything. So don't think that because you're interested in something else that therefore you cannot be a poet. In fact, you might be the best one there is. Thank you all.